Hey, welcome everybody to Hope for Our Times, and it's good to be here in studio. Well, not in studio with me, but I'm in studio. John's in his. Please welcome John Haller. John, great to have you on the program.
Always good to be back. It's been a while.
It's been quite a while, and then it's going to be a while again because I'm going to be going to Jerusalem and doing a lot of reporting from there. It's going to be exciting. So, yes, what a wild ride this world is, man.
Yeah, it's a shame there's nothing going on.
Absolutely nothing going on. So many different things are taking place. Did you see this one? John, I have a lot of questions to ask you. I have a ton of questions to ask you. But
Fire away.
this was reported out of The Guardian. Back to cash. Life without money in your pocket is not the utopia Sweden hoped. As we were watching, I'm looking at this going, as we were watching this building towards this new world order, this global system, there's a lot of problems. You had the Prophecy Roundtable when I was gone. You have another one coming up when I'm going to be gone again, unfortunately for me. But the push is going there, but there's this kingdom that's developing, John, it's looking partly strong and partly weak. Not everybody's going to be on board with these things that are coming.
Yeah, there's a lot of angst about what's happening. I mean, I think the thing we need to realize, though, is that the digitized system is here and it's not going away. It's not the utopia that everybody hoped for. I was reading an old part of an old book by a Chinese guy. Goodness, it must be 7 years old, talking about AI superpowers. And how that a lot of, there were at least 10 cities back in those days where China was pretty much cashless. And then, of course, we know what happened during the Charlie Vector 019er days. So, but, people like it. It's kind of funny because everybody wants digital. Everywhere you go, you have those digital places to pick, you can pay with your phone. But then we have restaurants we go to that you get a discount if you don't use a credit card because it costs them money, and their profit margins are tight enough anyway. So I think they're paying 3% or 4% on credit card transactions. So you actually get a discount if you pay cash. So we do carry cash with us.
Yeah, it's funny how that works. Speaking of utopia, Bill Feder, historian,
Sure.
American Minute. So he has a book on socialism, and he wrote this: after Columbus discovered the New World Order, there was a fascination among European scholars of setting up ideal societies, and one of those scholars was Sir Thomas More. And in the year 1516, he wrote a book describing a fictional island of utopia. This is hilarious. This is 500 years ago, a fictional island of utopia. His book was intended to be political satire, and he said the word utopia in Greek means nowhere, and one of the characters in the dialogue of the book was named Raphael Hathaladius, whose last name in Greek means peddler of nonsense. So you look at this and go, they're building their kingdom going nowhere and they're peddlers of nonsense. I thought that was great insight from Federer.
Well, that's kind of interesting thought, because you have this, all these novels that talk about dystopia, utopia, and it seems like the governments seem to want to take the dystopian ones, like 1984.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the famous dystopian novel. And I think, back in the Charlie Vector days, we had to remind everyone in government that was a horror story, not a user manual on how things should be done. But they seem to ignore that.
Okay, John, I'm going to throw this out to you. So EU has stated, and I'm pretty confident knowing you've talked quite a bit about this, they want to have, they're realizing, okay, the dynamics are changing between the EU and Trump and the US. Big changes. I was able to observe a little bit about what's going on while I was out, what's going on between Zelensky and all of the madness there. But the EU also says, hey, we're going to build an army. John, I'm looking at this going, I mean, I'm kind of challenged. I talked a little bit about this over the last, I think it was last night. But I'm looking at it going, Germany has less than 50 tanks. And out of the less than 50 tanks they have, they aren't even that good. And I'm looking at going, the whole EU is going to build this army, yet I believe there's a revived Roman Empire coming out of the West. But I'm looking at it going, what the heck is this? I mean, the more I think about it, the more I think, is this really possible? Then we watch this massive invasion of what's going on with Islam. I mean, my phone's blowing up the last 2 days with people, friends from the UK and different areas of Europe that are saying, hey, this is extremely bad with what's going on with Islam right now.
So that's kind of interesting because there's this controversy in our community about, where does this final beast empire come from? And I sort of have baskets, so I have my European basket, I have my Middle East, Islamic, Turkey basket, and that type of thing. And the interesting thing is, I said this a while back, that if the war doesn't return soon and this thing doesn't start to wrap up soon, it may be an Islamic empire from Europe that because of the way, the Islamization of Europe. And there's a very interesting article that the Financial Times has been covering this, and you can criticize that as a news source, but they're pretty good. And, I talk a lot about demographics, and they had a big article last week. It was like, yeah, Germany wants to build an army. Where are they going to get the guys to staff it? Because they talked about the fact that, let's see, when the invasion of Ukraine was started by Russia 3 years ago, there were about 200 conscientious objectors among military-age males in Germany. Now it's over 3,000. And a lot of them are just saying, we're not going to serve. They're talking about making a mandatory conscription, but they don't think people are going to comply with it. And if they do it, the only way they can get it through politically is to give them an option of public service for a year as opposed to military. But the guys don't want to serve. And you look at this on sort of a global scale, there's a collapse in military age males. Like Ukraine is over. I mean, there's just no way it can recover. And a lot of people left Ukraine. I have friends there, and whole families fled to Poland, millions of people, and they can't staff their army. But the same thing is true with Russia. Russia's having to bring in mercenaries from North Korea and Chechnya and Africa because there's not enough males in military age, like 18 to 40. And it's really bad in China. China's in this massive demographic collapse. So I hear a lot of, concern about China, but then I also, I don't know how quickly everything's going to wrap up, but China's just in a massive economic and demographic collapse. They can't recover from it. They will never recover from it. They've tried incentives. Well, here another example would be Japan. Japan has tried incentives to get people to have babies. But for probably 20 years now, they've sold more adult diapers in Japan than they have baby diapers on an annual basis. And over the last 2 years, Japan's population has declined by 3 million. I mean, that's like a city the size of Los Angeles has just gone away. And some of the numbers I hear coming out of China, depending on who you believe, they say it's like 1.3 or 1.4 billion. They're at least losing this year probably 100 million. And others think that their population might already be down to close to 800 million.
Wow.
Well, how do they staff it? And then it's aging. So, I guess, maybe they're going to have mechanized walkers for the elderly of China and Japan to man an army.
well, no, I 100% agree with this thing on China. I mean, I've looked at this for years, and I remember when I first started telling people, hey, you got a problem with this 200 million man army. This isn't what the Bible says. John, you and I have talked a lot about it. James and I have talked a lot about it. And man, just talk about people ridiculing you because you don't agree with the traditional teaching on it. Listen, And now people are starting to wake up to it. Hey, maybe the Bible doesn't actually say that. So we look at all these different demographic issues. You mentioned Japan, China, the EU, pretty much across the board, the U.S., and what do we have? Well, isn't that interesting? God says, be fruitful and multiply. Man says no. And if you do multiply, well, you better start aborting. And here we are, the consequences. Okay, with everything you said, do you think it's possible that some of the leaders in the EU actually think that they've blown open the borders? I believe 100% intentionally. But these are primarily military-age men who can fight. They're all over Europe, like what was happening here, finally getting shipped out of here. But with that, do you think that there's leaders in the EU that actually thought they could control these Muslim men that come over and do their bidding? Is that what they think? Is that what because they can build an army with these the Muslims that are coming over?
Well, it was. Yeah, it was probably related to the views in the United States that we could go over to these areas like Iraq and Afghanistan and put in Western-style democracy into cultures that don't accept that and have never accepted that. And I think they thought, well, look, there's a practical reason for this. And so you sort of have this, it's kind of a race in a certain sense. And I know you've talked about this on some of your programs. There's a guy named Peter, how do you say his name? Diamandis?
Yeah. That's as good as I can pronounce his name.
So he has this Megatrends publication he puts out about robots. And so now they're pushing robots, and the robots are developing pretty quickly so that they can do basic tasks like around the house, on assembly lines and that type of things. And part of that is because they don't have the people to do it. I saw Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs the other day, smart guy, very kind of droll sense of humor. But he was talking about the fact that, we've had a recovery of about 4 million jobs here in the United States after the Charlie Vector decline. But he was saying that there's like 8 million young males are just not participating. They're just not involved in society. So if they're not involved to work, how are they going to be involved to be in the military? And this is across the board. 5 years ago, I started tracking this because I read the Tehran Times and Iranian newspapers. And the Tehran Times 4 or 5 years ago published the fact, and this is the regime newspaper, published the fact that the fertility rate, the female fertility rate, had collapsed more quickly in Iran than any country in human history.
That's amazing. That's totally amazing.
And so what does this have on this? So you sort of have this race, like we need people to populate our militaries, but we're building robots. And a guy like Peter Diamandis will say, and you've got this, like I said, this pretty slick publication about robots and how many they're going to produce. And I was actually, there's a New Hillsdale University lecture by Derek Prince, former SEAL team guy, I think he is. And he's talking about robot wars, that this is where we're going to go. And how do we, but some of it's repurposing old technology. And then last week, I think it was on Monday, a week ago, the Wall Street Journal had an article about how Russia was increasing its use of horses in warfare.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, well, you read about horses in Ezekiel, and we think maybe we need to reinterpret that. And then maybe it's always difficult in these prophetic passages, because when my observation is when people have a problem with a passage that doesn't support their view, they spiritualize it. So then they can kind of argue around that particular problem. So it's just a very interesting thing. But you have the AI, the technology, and there's this race, but you have declines in population, and people could actually fight the war. I mean, I don't think, a military approaching you with, with half the guys using a walker to get to move forward is very frightening. But
so interesting you mentioned about the horses in Ezekiel 38. So that came up while I was gone, and so last night I talked briefly about it, and Don Stewart pointed this out to me. It was a good 20 years ago. He said, look, I'm telling you, this is what the Bible says, and something's going to happen where the military that comes, this invasion, Ezekiel 38, will involve horses. There is going to be a boots on the ground army. And he goes, it's going to happen. This is 20 years ago, and I mentioned that last night. And I said, one of the problems, and I totally agree with you, is on this too, is if you take Ezekiel 38, for example, most of us are going to go through it and say, well, this is literal. Gather back to Israel in the land in the last days. We know it's talking about Israel and the hills, peaceful people. You can tell. They're brought back from the place they've been scattered. Go right on through it and say it's all literal. Well, the horses don't mean literal. It's like all of a sudden you change it because it doesn't fit that eschatology view from years ago. So you can't do that. It's like if you have the context, stay with the context. I'll bring up another context. It's in Daniel chapter 11, speaking of a passage that I believe is a reference to Antichrist, where he will not regard women. The
desire of women, right?
The desire of women, thank you. And so many people have taken that to say, oh, therefore he's going to be a homosexual. That's not, the context has nothing to do with sexual preference. The context is he is the one who's going to be the self-proclaimed Messiah. That's the context of it. It has nothing to do with sex. And if you read
he doesn't view very favorably the desire of Jewish women to be the mother of the Messiah.
Right. That's what I believe. The context supports exactly what you said. And this is a problem that just in eschatology is like, we have the Bible, and sometimes, you and I have challenged with these things, is you have to stay with the context, because there are so many things that are built upon the latest news story. Therefore, and you go, wait a minute, or it just doesn't fit. And a person, typically prophecy people will say, will say, hey, you guys can't spiritualize this passage. It's literal. And then when it comes to something that doesn't support their own view, they'll flip the passage to something. I could give you a lot more. As you know, there's a lot of things that are done like that with prophecy.
Just one that comes to mind is, we have friends that believe that America is Babylon, Mystery Babylon of Revelation 17. And you can make that case, okay? But it's kind of interesting, too, that none of them have left. None of them have fled Babylon that hold that view.
That's a great point. But
then they talk about the blood of the martyrs. So when has the United States, when has America ever committed martyrdom to be this place where the blood of the martyrs is? And so I think that's a big problem. And then again, what you have is people will, when confronted with sort of a reality check on their particular view, they will spiritualize it. Well, that doesn't mean I don't think America is deserving of judgment or anything like that for the things that we've done. But we have to realize too that it's very difficult. And then you also have the writers of Scripture who were using things that they knew about to describe what they were seeing in these visions. And so it's a tricky thing to do. I think that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. So let's go here, because as we're looking at all these different developments, you mentioned China, you mentioned demographics. We can tell what's going on with Russia. Russia's in trouble. Ukraine's in a whole lot of trouble. Europe's in trouble. Iran's in trouble. You start looking at everything. We have a Trump presidency. We have Elon Musk. We have half the world loves him, half the world hates him. We have the AI dynamics. But then we look at Bible prophecy, and you start to think, well, wait a minute. How is Russia going to be this great army coming with Iran and Turkey? We can speculate. But man, this stuff is changing. It changes so fast, and it changes every day, that we start looking at everything together. So here's what I want to ask you. Recently, John, you discussed the situation in Syria, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. So let's start connecting these. Why do you think that is so important when it comes to studying Bible prophecy? And then this, how do current events in these areas align with or challenge the predictions that are made for us, for our man's understanding, that are made in the Bible?
Yeah, so let me sort of swerve off into an area because everybody talks about Ezekiel 38 and 39. Okay. And I've always struggled with the passage. Is it 38:13 that talks about Israel being, or maybe it's 39, about being at peace in the land?
38 verse 11, they'll dwell in peace,
11. Okay, yeah.
Peace and safety, two different Hebrew mean different words, one for safety, one for peace. And
land of unwalled villages.
Yeah, and the one for peace is totally neglected because it hasn't fit the narrative. That's my thinking, but go ahead.
Well, but that's difficult to fit that into the current context.
Yes.
Because I read the story over the weekend. This is just the evil of Hamas is just so far off the scale. So you've been down to the Gaza border. I was there just 2 years ago, before the war, before the invasion on October 7th. And they're very nice people. We went to several kibbutzim, and we had lunch, and we had dinner, and we had a lady came and talked. I've seen her on TV since, that lived at Niram. And what you learn is when they live in a commune, so they're sort of like, we would call them hippies. They're very nice people. They're peaceniks. They think, you can just love your neighbor and you're not going to have any problems. And then that was shattered. And they had 18,000 people a day coming over from Gaza to work in Israel before October 7th. And they even talked about how a group of these Palestinians met the leadership at Nir Oz, one of the most devastated of the kibbutzim in the October 7th invasion. It wasn't a terror attack, it was an invasion by a foreign army. And they met. And it was 2 weeks later, the people who met with these peace-loving people at the kibbutz were the ones that came in and killed them and kidnapped them. So it was a complete head fake by the Hamas people. And I mentioned this to you last week. So here we have the president of the United States come out and say, we're just going to wipe out Gaza. We're just going to wipe it out. And a week ago, and it's always interesting how the scripture portions that are read in Jewish synagogues and temples, they have the same portion. And so every synagogue will be on the same portion. It's like a lectionary book. And a week ago, the Haftorah portion was 1 Samuel 15. And that was Samuel telling the King Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, go wipe out the Amalekites, Amalek. And Amalek was the grandson of Esau after he married into the line of Ishmael. And the command was to wipe them out, and he didn't. And it was utterly destroy them, every man, woman, and child. And so we have this thing in Gaza, which is like a recapitulation of Amalek, of the Amalekites, because they're trained from the ground up in school to do this. And how do you change that? So there's all these people running around. Okay, we can make peace. We can come into some kind of agreement with them, and we can retrain them. And I'm sort of I'm looking at this. I'm looking at what's happening in Syria. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But they don't change. How do you change them? And so, is the admonition to go about the to go after and utterly destroy the Amalekites? Is this Amalek in our generation? And now we have a prime minister of Israel who is of the tribe of Benjamin, they say, And is he ignoring what Samuel told King Saul to do? And by the way, it didn't work out very well for King Saul. And then we just had this past week, we had Purim, which was the story of where another Amalekite, Haman, tried to wipe out all of the Jews in the Persian Empire. And that's sort of relevant to what's going on too. So it's sort of like this cycle. All of this stuff that we read about in Scripture is being recapitulated in the world that we live in today. And I've said this many times, the prophetic scriptures, when they're fulfilled, will unfold in a real world that people live in. And now we have the problem with a Islamist regime in Syria.
To the
Crazy
point,
stuff.
Let me ask you this. Like, you go into Syria, I mean, I have a lot to say. It is, along with everything you mentioned, if you look at Gaza, that's an area that Israel was unfaithful, specifically the tribe of Dan. You have Judea and Samaria, who the world calls the West Bank, another area where God judged them both in the past with Assyria and Babylon. You have the Golan Heights, where Dan relocated. When Dan didn't want Gaza, they moved up north to the Golan Heights. And what are the four areas that Israel is still dealing with today, which speaks to your point? It's also interesting in Numbers chapter 33, where Moses is told by the Lord, or he tells the people, when you cross the Jordan, this is what you must do. You must remove the inhabitants. He didn't say slaughter them all at that point. He says, he's not talking about Amalek specifically there, but he says you must remove the inhabitants of the land everywhere I give to you. And then he says this in chapter 33, verse 55, he says, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. Moreover, it shall be that I will do to you as I thought to do to them. I mean, and you look at just with all the things that you're putting together, it's like God is saying, look here, we are, because this goes back 3,000 years and even further. Which is another reason for me to believe the proximity of the days that we live into the last days is that it's like God saying, okay, we're going to deal with this again. We're dealing with it again in the same areas, and then you can even throw Syria in there because fascinating things have developed in Syria over the last week or two also. So all of it is like definitely these are you can't make this stuff up moments.
Well, look at Syria, Tom. I mean, so I think the last time we did was something in the latter part of January, and we had talked, I think we were talking in early December on a program, and Syria was falling to these Islamists. And this guy, first when he came on the scene, it was called al-Jilani. His family was tied to the Golan Heights. That's why he had that name. Now he's called al-Shara. He's sort of approaching Elizabeth Taylor and the number of different last names that he's had. And it seems like it's always changing, but he's completely remade. He's trimmed his beard, he's got a haircut, wears suits. And there's a great picture out there with the picture of him when he was in ISIS and the picture now, it's half ISIS, half this. And so now they're going into these villages in the Alawite region, Latakia and those areas. And it's hard to know how many have been killed. I've heard 1,000, I've heard 22,000. I've heard a bunch of Christians, and I've heard thousands of Alawites, which most Muslims, Sunni Muslims, would consider to be heretical anyway. Even Iran would consider them heretics, but they used them because they were very pragmatic about establishing their supply lines to Hezbollah, and also to Hezbollah and the Hezbollah militias that were in Syria. And it was a stunning thing that they took over. It's clear that they're backed by Turkey. I think I mentioned that poster the last time I was on your program that Erdogan had about, first yesterday Hagia Sophia, today the Shias, the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and tomorrow Al-Aqsa, and the Jews. And but even Putin in his end of the year news conference in about 3 months ago now said that Damascus was protected by a Syrian army of about 30 or 40,000 people, 30 to 40,000 men. And that al-Jilani, al-Shara's HTS group came in and took it over with 800 to 850 people, took over Damascus. That's Putin's own words that said that. So I don't know now, but now we're seeing their true colors come out. So I will give Israel credit for all the mistakes that they made leading up to October 7th. And that's starting to come out quite a bit, that they ignored the warnings. Mm-hmm. They didn't, they thought they could manage the problem. But give them credit that once they saw the opportunity, it was like they understood what al-Shara, al-Jilani, HTS was like. So they have spent, I've got maps that are published, you can find them online, that show all the Israeli military strikes on Syrian army military bases and supplies. And then remember, was it, it's hard to remember. I don't know if it was in September. There was this commando raid on a missile manufacturing facility in Syria. IDF commandos went in and they spent hours going through and just destroying this place and blowing it up. They had to get through these. It's a fascinating operation that they did. So they've been very, very proactive in this case. So I hopefully they learned their lesson from October 7th, when they were clearly asleep in many respects.
Well, hopefully. So also, John, I know the Druze are now in a lot of the territory in southern Syria.
Right.
And Israel is there. The IDF is there. And there's Druze that still, last I checked, they want to be part of Israeli territory. So when you look at what's going on with Israel, I'll be in the Golan Heights next week. I'm going to be in Mount Bental. Some of you who are watching this are going to be there with me. Let me tell you, it is remarkable, because thinking of the IDF being in that territory, John, you've been to Mount Bental probably 100 times. You stand up there, you look into Syria, and you see the DMZ, right? And then you see Syria. Well, now, that was never, the IDF couldn't be there. Well, now they are all over there. I think, talk about being a safe place to go. I can't wait to be up at Mount Bental and send you some pictures. John, this is remarkable. It's going to be absolutely remarkable, because I've never seen, none of us have ever seen that site yet. And I get to be there next week, and you'll be there soon enough too with your group. It's exciting days. But what are your thoughts on this whole Druze thing with the IDF, and where do you see that going?
Well, they brought about 100 of them from Syria into Israel to meet with the Druze in Majel Shams, which is a Druze village in northern Israel. I know you've been there. And it's different. The people, they dress different. It's a different culture. And so they're going to some Druze holy site down near Tiberias. I'm not sure exactly where that is, but the Druze claim to be the offspring of Jethro, who was, I believe, the father-in-law of Moses. Mm-hmm. So there's this connection there, but this is the first time so when the 67 war happened, that border went up, that DMZ went up there in the Golan Heights, no man's land. And you can stand there and look at it. You can see the UN trucks driving around. Pam and I actually were driving up there one time on our own, and I went down this road, and I kind of went through this gate, and I'm like, and then I saw this rusty UN sign. And I thought, I don't think I should be here. And so, you can see that, there's that military outpost up on top of the hill there in the Golan. And I'm sure to look at that dumb American down there driving around, doesn't know where he's going. He made a wrong turn. His GPS didn't work. But I was right along the border, And there's ISIS in those days. This was 2017. There's ISIS in those days on the other side of the border. So the Druze have been fighting against the ISIS and the different militias in southern Syria. They want Israeli protection for the most part. Some have entered in now, sort of signed pacts with the al-Shalani government. The Kurds have signed a pact with the al-Shalani government. Oh, we're going to be great. We're a man of peace. We want this, Well, we'll have elections in 5 years, maybe. But in the meantime, oh, by the way, it's a one religion state. And so there's going to be Sharia law. And now you see the start of the enforcement of Sharia law in the Alawite region. And I don't know, the whole thing is a mess. So I will give Israel credit. Make a buffer zone, take over all of Mount Hermon. You can't trust these people, and take out all these military installations that you can. They just bombed a bunch last week. So I don't know. But this Druze thing, they're coming across the border to reunite with their family members for the first time in over 50 years.
It is really amazing when you look at what, as of now, what's come out since October 7, because of these things. Israel's definitely not, going back to Ezekiel 38, they're not in the place of peace that Ezekiel 38 verse 11 says. They're nowhere near that. But what we do see is Israel is making some very significant progress in the land alone. So I'm going to be meeting with Avi Lipkin here in 2 weeks in Jerusalem. And he, I asked him about Judea and Samaria. He's absolutely convinced that Jews are going to be flocking to the area from throughout the world, especially the U.S., to the areas of Judea and Samaria. And I find it interesting because something still has to happen there. I know, John, you have a lot of friends in those areas that you talk to that are in politics or in the military. What is their assessment of Judea and Samaria? Because those areas are still a little bit of a challenge.
Well, I think it's more than a little bit of a challenge. I was being
nice,
But they're doing operations in that area, particularly up in Samaria near Jenin and Nablus, they've never done before. And they're occupying, they're sending military and say, these guys are going in, we're not leaving. And now we have this. So remember when Bibi Netanyahu was with Trump a little over a month ago now, and there was a question asked of Trump, what's your position on Israeli annexation of Judea and Samaria? And Trump said, we'll have something in about 4 weeks. So it's been a little over 4 weeks. He's probably been a little bit busy signing too many other executive orders and that type of thing. It's like somebody, I think Lawrence O'Donnell from MSNBC said he's taking a break because he's exhausted trying to keep up with Trump, which is good. So there's benefits to this. But so what's going to be the position on the annexation? And I mentioned this, I did a podcast with, I think, Brandon Holdhouse last week. And Roddy, our friend Roddy, got back to me because I said, one of the things, and I don't know if you've driven up there, I'm sure you have. We were with Joel Kramer, Pam and I, and we drove up through the Central Highlands, the biblical heartland of the Bible, Shiloh, Shem, Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, through Nablus and all this stuff. And the thing that struck me, Joel kind of mocked me for saying it, but the thing that kind of struck me as significant was every hillside up through the Central Highlands, the Central Mountains, the watershed of Israel, where the rain falls, they can't give this away. Jared Kushner was an idiot. Okay. And I saw, by the way, a 4-year-old interview of him. Everybody said, oh, he didn't believe in a two-state. He said, my two-state solution. That's how he referred to it in this interview from 4 years ago. But every hillside up through there, from top to bottom, is terraced for farming. It's like 30, 40 miles you drive on Highway 60. Every single hillside, top to bottom, is terraced for farming. And you're thinking, like, who was here? Who built this? And where did they go? And so when you read Ezekiel 35 and 36, it talks about, the prophecies of two peoples We're here. We have the highlands. We're the important people. This is playing out right in front of us.
It's fascinating. I'm looking forward to going to Shechem, going to Jacob's well, and these different things. And it's just so, it's almost surreal watching all the different things that are developing globally, the geopolitical movements. But at the same time, you look at Israel and you go, God is faithful. Psalm 121. He's the keeper of Israel. He never slumbers or sleeps. It's hard to look at Israel and not see things developing to what the Bible calls the last days. And John, you're going to be there in the fall. I'll be back to the same areas as you in the fall. Plus, I'll be there next week too. But I'm looking at this going, this is really. I'm really excited about going to these areas. Going to Shechem, of course, Shiloh. That's been pretty much open all along. But these other areas too. And I'm going. And at the same time, I watched Netanyahu. It was just the other day. I think he said something like, "Hey, we are taking Gaza. It is ours, and we're not going to give it back. It is Israel territory." And I'm thinking that is something that's going to have to happen with Judea and Samaria too. This is Israel's land. God gave Israel this land. You have the British Mandate. We have all of these other things. They were the true colonialists, no matter what anybody says. It was not Israel. This is Israel's land. God is going to be faithful, but Israel has to do what they've got to do.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I think I sent you a little link to a lecture, 17-minute lecture that a guy named Eric Weinstein gave at a ARC conference. And the thing that I mentioned to you was that I'm watching secular people. So Eric Weinstein would describe himself as a progressive, liberal, atheist Jew. But so he gives this lecture at this big conference a week or so ago, and he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 21 about the destruction of Babylon. And he's like, we're seeing this in our day, that the whole world order has been turned upside down. And it's just very interesting to me that you see non-religious people, non-churched people speak in biblical terms. So I think the quote I sent to you was, everything seems to be very biblical.
You did. So did he actually say that?
Yeah.
That is,
he was sort of tying Isaiah 21 to a song by Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix.
Okay.
It's kind of an interesting theological leap. It's, I don't know that it would pass muster. Well, maybe it would pass muster in most seminaries now that I think about it. So.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that he says it's getting biblical, and these are atheists, and it's just really something to watch this.
He used the term Babylon and Watchmen. I just watched it before we started our talk. And I'm like, so it's ARC, it's Eric Weinstein. Mm-hmm. And he does he's very engaging guy, but I think he's a physicist. And he talks about, how we've got a lot of problems, and there's these guys who think they can, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. He's talking at a conference called ARC, the ARC. He's almost talking like in terms of like Yuval Harari talked about, well, maybe we can just build an ark to protect all the elites. I just am fascinated when non-biblical, anti-Jesus people speak in biblical terms. They speak in biblical terms sometimes more than some pastors do, which is another issue.
Yeah, very interesting how this whole thing is flipping. I find this fascinating too when you look at Romans chapter 11, where God says, do not be ignorant of this mystery, brethren, lest you be puffed up in your own mind. Blindness part has happened to Israel till the fullness of the Gentiles has come, then all Israel will be saved. It's like we're watching this turning from the Gentile world, God's attention, pouring out of his Holy Spirit. It's like we're watching the slow but rapid turn at the same time. And the focus is becoming so much on Israel. I mean, We didn't even get to the Temple Mount today, or a coming temple, or any of that. But I'm curious, maybe we can for our last few minutes. But what should, just given the things we've talked about, including the different nations, what do you think we should be looking for in the coming year regarding all of these dynamics? I mean, there's a lot that we've brought up today.
Well, I think of immediate terms in Israel is, what are they going to do with Gaza? They can't let people stay there. So that's going to cause a conflagration throughout the Islamic world. But then again, I'm not Arabic, but I sort of watched Arabs enough that I think I understand is they'll say something, but maybe they don't really mean it. So you'll see, Mohammed bin Salman say, well, we need to have a two-state solution in Israel, but is that what he really believes? And is he just sort of respecting, that's his father's view? So when his father goes, what's going to happen? And by the way, Neom's having a lot of problems and that type of thing. But the point of Neom is, when they build it, the architects were saying, this is our Babylon. And so they're using biblical terms again in the end times, talking about things that the Bible says are going to sort of recapitulate themselves in the end. And so I think what happens in Gaza is the Abraham Accords going to expand. Right now, it looks like Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, the new Lebanese government, are sort of like, yeah, we would like to do this. We don't want to be at this war. We don't want to be bombed all the time. So that might be an expansion of peace. And maybe this is how Israel gets to this Ezekiel 38 thing of peace, living in peace and safety. But then you have the problem with Iran. What are they going to do with Iran? Iran, that the taking out of their air defenses, that's a lack of air defense systems, modern air defense systems, is a declining asset that you can rely on. They're going to replace them. And unfortunately, Trump is there. I think he understands the issue. And we're resupplying Israel. But then we have these bombs that Israel doesn't have the capacity to deliver them to Iran, bunker busters. It's not the Moab one. There's one called MOP. And it's like a 30,000 pounds, and only 6,000 pounds is explosive. The other 24,000 pounds is like reinforced heavy steel, so it can penetrate through reinforced concrete and then explode. But we're the only Air Force that can deliver those with a B-1B or a B-52, which are doing exercises. So there's something going to happen with Iran in the near future. It's either going to be a deal or it's going to be some conflagration. And I don't want to go too long, but in Israel, they just had some Channel 12 publish some things. There's a big article in the Jerusalem Post on Monday morning today about the people in Iran are really sick of this. They're sick of living in poverty. They're releasing videos, and these were published in Israel last week from people in Iran, where they're showing shopping malls, neighborhoods, very wealthy neighborhoods, people dressing in Western dress. But they said these are not the regular people in Iran. We're in poverty. We're under siege. These are the elites, the IRGC, the government, and that type of thing. And so it's sort of like bomb Khomeini's house and we can take over Iran. So I don't know. I think something's going to happen there. I just don't know exactly. And I'm sort of thinking, like, how does this all play into, the prophetic scriptures? And if Iran is defeated, is that the end of it? Mm-hmm. Because we know Ezekiel 38 and 39 still to come. So maybe our timeline on Ezekiel 38 and 39 is not at the beginning of this last period. Maybe it's to the middle or to the end. I don't know. we'll have to watch it and see what happens.
Well, speaking of, David Hawking puts it at the end.
I think he did it early on in his ministry. Then he kind of shifted.
Well, he didn't shift the last time I had an interview with him. The last time I had an interview with him, he started arguing with me about it. But
David, I've known David since I was a little kid. And so, he's kind of an interesting guy because his views on some things of Bible prophecy have changed over time, because until they happen, they're not set exactly in stone.
You're right. And I appreciate that so much, John, because too often in Bible prophecy, people just read it, therefore this it, and they can't move off that mark. But listen, these things, as you've mentioned many times, even today, prophecy is pattern. So you see this, and the closer we get, the better understanding we're going to have of things. Daniel's message from the angel is, hey, listen, seal it up until the time of the end. And then also, and then it's for the time of the end. Those people who live at that time, also Daniel a few verses later, the wicked will see it, they won't understand, but the wise will see it and they will understand. They're going to get it, and it's going to become more and more clear, and we need to be willing to use the Bible, but there's too many people that just take the news and say, therefore it means this. We got to be very careful on that stuff.
I compare it to the eye chart. I'm nearsighted. My wife is farsighted. So I can pick up my phone in the middle of the night and read it. We've got these reader glasses all over the place. They're in the glove box. They're in the cup holders. They're by the TV. I mean, it's crazy. But I go to the eye doctor and I often say, I'm nearsighted. So they take off my glasses. They give me the eye chart. And even being as nearsighted as I am, I get the E. I can get that big E because they never scramble that one. It's always the same, and I memorized it. But the lower ones, now they used to be the same, but now they're scrambling them. But if I take off my glasses, the point is, even nearsighted, as I get closer to that chart, I can read, manufactured by so-and-so at the bottom in the really tiny print. And I think that's sort of how this Bible prophecy stuff unfolds. As we get closer to that eye chart of the end times, we're going to see things more clearly. And that's what it says in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, the wise will understand and instruct many. So I just think we sort of need to be a little bit open-minded about how exactly this is going to play out. And sometimes I think, sometimes I think God has a sense of humor. And he's up there kind of throwing cosmic knuckleballs and spitballs at us like, but you don't think that can happen now? Watch this. And then he works it out to his glory and according to his perfect plan. So I kind of think we're at that stage right now.
That was great. Great time with you today, John. Good to have you back. I'll be sending you things from Israel when I get there next week.
Well, I may set up, if we can arrange it, I may set up an interview with you while you're on the ground there.
That would be cool. Just send me the link and we'll work it out. It might be 2 a.m. for me, but it'd be great. It'd be fantastic. Roddy would love to do something too, so maybe the two of us can get on together.
When you get together, we'll do that.
That would be great. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And boy, what a world we live in. John, great having you. What would be a final word of encouragement you would have for everybody?
I think that this is, one is, don't be driven by fear. I think that I see that a lot. And we know that with the stress of the end times comes great hope. So I think we need to kind of be looking for the blessed hope. In fact, I think I have a friend who has a ministry called Hope for Our Times.
Yes,
right?
Imagine that. There is hope. And don't get too caught up in all the crazy stuff going on because it changes every day. But we have this word which never changes, never leads us astray. God cannot lie. And we have the hope of the Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks, John. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you all in a little while.